Right, hi everybody, welcome back. Moving on with topic 7.3. Topic 7.3 is called Climate Change, Mitigation and Adaptation. And in the second video, we'll look specifically at adaptation. Like last time, I'll just click very quickly on the definitions again. And we called adaptation the action or process of changing something to suit a new situation. So basically, adaptation to climate change is how humankind will change behaviours, technologies, to try to deal with the new reality of climate change in the future. Now, obviously, when you look at essay questions on this topic, often you're asked to look at case studies. A little bit difficult here because we're projecting into the future. So a lot of this, the case studies that I might mention will be things that might have to be put in place in the future. Although I have tracked down a few ideas of things that are actually starting to be put in place already to adapt to this new reality of climate change. And what I decided to do was split it into what I think is the four main adaptations that we'll have to deal with. The first is adapting to deal with rises in sea levels. The second is adapting to changes in the availability of fresh water on a global scale. The third is changes to how we grow our foodstuffs in agriculture. And then finally, we can say a few things about humans, how humans will have to adapt to changes in temperature, especially in terms of extreme weather events and extremely high temperatures in some locations and at some parts of the year. Okay. Pretty short, really, as far as the syllabus is concerned. Here is another definition of adaptation or adaptation strategies. Adaptation strategies can be used to reduce adverse effects and maximise positive effects. Examples include flood defences, vaccination programmes, desalination plants, changes in how we plant crops. I think I'll cover all or most of those. And then it says adaptive capacity varies from place to place and can be dependent on financial and technological resources. So therefore, obviously, the response in MEDCs will have to be different to the response in LEDCs. And it also calls for international agreements and international help from MEDCs to LEDCs. I'll look at that more, I think, in the next video, where I want to focus especially on international efforts to tackle climate change, both in terms of adaptation but also mitigation. Okay, so I think we can get through this fairly quickly. So number one, we can look at changes in sea levels. Obviously, as ice at the poles melts, we expect sea levels to rise and therefore threaten settlements and people who live on coastal areas. So therefore, we can take a technocentric approach and we can look at building flood defences, dikes, ditches, sea walls. One case study you might want to look at is the fact that the US Navy is now building sea walls around its bases at the Washington Naval Yard and the US Naval Academy. Here is a picture of the London, or the Thames River barrier in London. This was actually built in the 1970s to prevent flooding in London. And what happens is gates between these barriers can rise when large amounts of water flowing upstream, not downstream. So very, very high tides or during storms, big storm events. Now, because storms and extreme weather events are becoming more likely, the Thames barrier has had to close much more over the last few years than before. In fact, there are some claims that it might be becoming inadequate, but we might have to see barriers of this type being built in big cities where they've been built on rivers or coastlines. Incidentally, in 2016, Donald Trump applied for planning permission to build a seawall around his golf course and on the coast of County Clare Island, and he cited as the reason changes in sea levels due to climate change. Possibly a little bit hypocritical. Okay, in addition to trying to prevent flooding, as I've said before, we could change the way we construct settlements and buildings, flood-proof buildings and buildings that are able to float. or raise up on legs, perhaps. And then finally, a very sad story. Some locations might have to accept that the people living there will have to migrate, and in some cases even be evacuated. You might have heard of the island of Tuvalu in the South Pacific. It's projected that Tuvalu will be underwater completely in the next 50 to 100 years if sea levels continue to rise at current rates. And plans are already in place to evacuate the entire population of that nation to New Zealand in the future, which is a very sad story. Okay, number 2, freshwater availability. I think we said this before. In the future, conflicts might be more and more consequent due to fights over water supplies, just as they are for oil these days. As temperatures change and climates change, freshwater availability changes in some areas. So many places depend on monsoons for the stocks of water, for example, and monsoon seasons are likely to change. More than 1 billion people in the north of India and Pakistan and Nepal depend on water directly from glaciers in the Himalayas. If those glaciers melt, there's going to be big water problems and water shortages in the Indian subcontinent. Another problem is as sea levels rise and water comes inland and into groundwater, we see groundwater becoming more salinized, more salty, and therefore that affects soils as well. Okay. We might have to see much more transport of fresh water on a huge scale, possibly on countrywide scales. And more countries might become dependent on the desalination of seawater to produce potable or drinking water. And again, like we said before, all of these effects might lead to mass migration away from these areas that have been affected. Number 3, agriculture. We've talked about biome shifts as a result of climate change. As biome shifts occur, so do changes in areas where we're able to grow specific crops. So what might happen in the future, for example, in the United States, is that the areas or the breadbasket of the US across the centre of the US might be unsuitable for growing staple crops like wheat. One approach might be to replace those staple crops with others that are more suited to those environments. So I've said here, perhaps replacing wheat with sorghum. Another possible approach is to move those breadbasket areas further north to cooler climates. We might have to change agricultural methods in response to changes in water availability. I won't go into that because we'll cover that more when we look at soils specifically later in the course. And in MEDCs at least, we might have to accept decreased availability of some products, at least in certain seasons, because it might be just become too expensive to grow them in a changed climate. And then finally, another very sad idea is that we might have to accept a much higher increase in the rate of famines, obviously especially in LEDCs. And again, that could lead to more and more mass migration. And then finally, just a very short idea. Global temperature itself might lead us having to be much more dependent on air conditioning and refrigeration. In 2020, when I recorded this, I think I've said this before, the highest global temperature, or the highest temperature ever recorded in human history was recorded in California, in Death Valley. I actually should have written down the temperature, where I can't remember, 50-something degrees Celsius. Another thing we might have to accept is that as temperatures change, patterns of disease change, especially with the spread of mosquitoes, for example, to areas where they couldn't survive before. So we might have to accept much greater incidence of malaria or other diseases like dengue fever or Zika virus. Okay, I think it's quite a short video this time, but I think that covers the ideas of adaptation. Again, a lot of this is projection into the future, but I did give a couple of examples of measures that people are taking at the moment to try to deal with some of these effects. Okay, I hope that made sense. I hope it was helpful, and we'll speak again in the classroom. Okay, take care everybody, and goodbye.